Right now, the world is watching missiles fly over Dubai, protests in American cities over constitutional questions, oil prices spiking and crashing within the same week. These things dominate the news cycle and they feel urgent because they are. But today, I want to step back from the daily explosions and the hourly diplomatic claims and look at the bigger picture. Because what is happening in the Middle East right now is not just a regional conflict. It is a stress test for the entire global system. Every nation that depends on energy will feel this. Every economy built on predictable shipping lanes will have to adapt. Every ordinary person who buys food or fills a tank or turns on a light is connected to what happens next in the Strait of Hormuz. And understanding these trends now before they fully arrive is the difference between being prepared and being completely blindsided. So here is the one idea I want you to hold in your mind throughout this entire discussion. The world is entering the era of transactional geography. For the past 50 years, the entire global economy has rested on one assumption. That assumption is this. Critical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Malacca Strait, these narrow passageways that carry the lifeblood of the world economy, will remain open to everyone at all times for free. Every container ship, every oil tanker, every supply chain that feeds 7 billion people, all of it has been built on the idea that geography is neutral, that the sea is free, that no single nation can close a choke point and hold the world hostage. This assumption runs so deep that no one even thinks about it. Every city in Europe, every factory in Asia, every grocery store in America, all of it resting on that one idea. But the 2026 US-Iran conflict is destroying that assumption permanently. And when an assumption that foundational breaks, everything built on top of it has to change. What we are witnessing right now is the emergence of three massive waves of change: the weaponization of choke points, the monetization of access, and the fragmentation of energy security. Nations that understand these trends and adapt will survive and thrive. Nations that ignore them will struggle in ways they cannot yet imagine. Let me start with the first trend, the weaponization of choke points. Think about something you have never stopped to question. Why does oil from the Middle East cost the same whether you are in Tokyo or New York? Why can a tanker leave Saudi Arabia and arrive in Europe without paying a toll to anyone except port fees? The answer seems obvious, because the ocean is international waters. But think about it more carefully. That system only works as long as two things are true. First, that no regional power has the military capability to close a critical strait. And second, that no regional power is desperate enough to try. What happens when those two things disappear? You get February 28, 2026. On that day, Iran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil supply flows, not by sinking ships, not by mining the entire channel, but by creating a threat environment so hostile that insurance companies refuse to cover any vessel flying a US or Israeli flag, and most commercial shippers simply stopped trying. Oil prices soared over 50% in a single week. This was not a temporary disruption. This was a deliberate strategic choice by a regime that understood it could not win a conventional war, but could win an economic one. Now here is the historical foundation. From 1945 to 2026, 81 years, the global economy operated under what we call the Pax Americana maritime system. The United States Navy guaranteed freedom of navigation. It did not matter if you were an ally or a rival. If you were a commercial vessel, you could pass through any international waterway without fear. This was not charity, it was strategy. The US wanted global trade to flourish because global trade made everyone richer and created dependencies that prevented wars. Countries like Japan, South Korea, Germany, they built their entire economies on this guarantee. They imported energy from the Gulf, they exported manufactured goods to the world, and they never had to worry about whether the sea lanes would be open tomorrow. That arrangement is now cracking because the assumption that underpinned it, that the US would always have the will and the resources to keep every choke point open for everyone, is no longer true. And here is where history becomes deeply uncomfortable. The last time a resource-scarce industrial power faced the possibility of energy cutoff was Japan in the 1930s. When the US and its allies restricted Japan's access to oil and steel, Japan did not accept decline. It invaded Southeast Asia to seize the resources it needed. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes, and right now it is rhyming very loudly. Now let me give you the current proof. On February 28, 2026, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, and the global oil market entered a state of shock. By March 20th, The Trump administration issued a sanctions waiver allowing 140 million barrels of Iranian crude oil already loaded on tankers to be sold on the open market. The stated reason was to flood the market and lower prices, but the real reason was panic. Gasoline prices in the United States were climbing toward $5 a gallon in an election year. India, which had been importing 2.6 million barrels per day from the Gulf, pivoted entirely to Russian oil, reaching 60 million barrels in March alone, near record levels. China negotiated direct passage through the strait by paying the Iranian Revolutionary Guard an estimated $2 million per tanker. This is happening right now, not in 5 years right now. Compare the United States, which is energy independent and produces more oil than it consumes, to Japan, which imports 90% of its energy and has no overland alternatives. Japan is in a fundamentally vulnerable position. Or compare China, which now has preferential access to Iranian oil because it pays the toll, to Europe, which is cut off entirely. What does Europe do in a world where choke points are weaponized? History answers it. It either accepts vassalage to whoever controls the choke point, or it goes to war to reopen it. The assumption that geography is neutral is dead, and every nation that built its economy on free passage is now scrambling to adapt. Now, the second trend, the monetization of access. Have you ever thought about who owns the Strait of Hormuz? The answer is no one and everyone. It is international waters, but it sits between Iran and Oman. And Iran has now decided that if it cannot use the strait freely, then no one else can either, unless they pay. This only works as long as two things are true. First, that the international community agrees on the principle of free navigation and enforces it collectively. And second, that no single nation has the leverage to break that consensus. What happens when those two things disappear? You get the Iranian monetization strategy. In March 2026, the Iranian state-linked newspaper Jiang published an editorial arguing that international law permits the levying of fees for securing a waterway. Under this framework, vessels from China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan are allowed passage through the strait upon payment of a fee. This is not piracy. This is a government declaring that it controls access to a geographic feature and charging rent. It is a toll booth on the global economy. The historical foundation for this goes back to the era of colonial monopolies and mercantilist control, but the modern parallel is the Suez Canal. Egypt nationalized the Suez in 1956 and ever since has charged fees for passage. The difference is that Suez fees are predictable, internationally recognized, and relatively low. The Iranian model is extortionate, selective, and designed to create political division. Countries that pay, like China and India, get energy. Countries that refuse, like the United States and Israel, do not. This creates a two-tier global economy where access to energy depends not on your ability to pay market price, but on your willingness to submit to Iranian terms. And here is where history becomes deeply uncomfortable. The last time a major power tried to monetize control of a strategic waterway for political leverage was the Soviet Union during the Cold War, when it threatened to close access to the Baltic. The West responded with NATO and a military guarantee, but in 2026, the West is divided, exhausted, and unsure whether it wants to fight another war over a principle. Here's the current proof. By March 25, 2026, Iran had launched 357 ballistic missiles and 1,815 drone attacks against the United Arab Emirates alone. These attacks targeted infrastructure, airports, desalination plants, hotels. A fire broke out at the Fairmont Hotel on the Palm Jumeirah. Debris from an intercepted missile damaged the Burj Al Arab. One civilian, a Nepali security guard, was killed. In Qatar, 17% of LNG export capacity was destroyed. In Saudi Arabia, 37 drones were launched in a single 24-hour period on March 25th and 26th, killing 2 Bangladeshi workers. This is happening right now, not in 5 years, right now. And yet, despite this bombardment, tankers from China and India continue to pass through the strait because they pay the fee. The cost of a defensive interceptor, a Thaadi or Patriot missile, is over $3 million. The cost of a Shahed drone is under $20,000. The arithmetic of attrition favors Iran. The United States cannot afford to defend every Gulf state indefinitely. It cannot replenish its interceptor stockpiles until 2027, and it cannot sustain this level of military expenditure without domestic political collapse. Compare the United States, which is spending billions per week to keep the strait contested, to China, which is spending $2 million per tanker to keep it open. China is in a fundamentally stronger position. What does the United States do in a world where access is monetized and it cannot afford to compete? The assumption that international waters are free is being replaced by the reality that everything has a price and the price is set by whoever controls the choke point. Now, the third trend, the fragmentation of energy security. Think about something you take for granted. When you turn on a light or start your car, you assume the energy will be there. You assume the price will be roughly predictable. You assume that if one source is disrupted, another will replace it. That assumption only works as long as two things are true. First, that energy markets are globalized and interconnected, so that a disruption in one region can be offset by production in another. And second, that all major consumers have access to those global markets on roughly equal terms. What happens when those two things disappear? You get energy nationalism and fragmentation. Nations start hoarding. They start building exclusive bilateral deals. They start treating energy not as a commodity, but as a weapon. And the global market, which kept prices stable and supply predictable, fractures into regional blocks where access depends on politics, not economics. The historical foundation for this is the 1970s oil embargo. In 1973, Arab members of OPEC cut oil exports to nations supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Prices quadrupled, gas lines stretched for miles, economies went into recession. But that embargo was temporary. It lasted months, not years, and it was conducted within a globalized market where alternative suppliers eventually stepped in. The 2026 fragmentation is different. It is structural. Iran is not embargoing oil. It is selectively granting access. Russia is doing the same, using energy as leverage over Europe. China is locking in long-term contracts with both. And the United States, despite being energy independent, is caught in the middle because its allies are not. This creates a situation where energy security is no longer a global public good, but a privilege granted to those who align with the right powers. And here is where history becomes deeply uncomfortable. The last time energy security fragmented along political lines was the late 1930s, when Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan built autarkic systems to survive blockades. Those systems required conquest. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes, and right now it is rhyming very loudly. Here is the current proof. India, which had reduced Russian oil imports under U.S. pressure in 2025, ramped them back up to 60 million barrels in March 2026, replacing the 2.6 million barrels per day it lost from the Gulf. Indian government sources stated they will source crude from whoever is competitively priced and deliverable, explicitly rejecting U.S. sanctions as a constraint. On March 20th, the U.S. Treasury issued a waiver permitting the sale of 140 million barrels of Iranian crude already loaded on ships, a complete reversal of the maximum pressure campaign. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called it using Iranian barrels against Tehran, but the reality is it was a desperate attempt to lower domestic gasoline prices before the midterms. The U.S. also issued a 30-day waiver for Russian oil already at sea and released 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is happening right now, not in 5 years, right now. Compare Saudi Arabia, which has spare production capacity and can theoretically replace lost Iranian barrels, to Japan, which has no domestic production and no overland alternatives. Saudi Arabia is in a strong position. Japan is deeply vulnerable. What does Japan do in a world where energy security is fragmented and it cannot access the Gulf? It either becomes dependent on China, which controls access, or it militarizes and secures its own supply lines by force. The assumption that energy markets are global and accessible to all is being replaced by the reality that energy security is a bilateral privilege and those without leverage will be left in the dark. So let me compress this. As choke points are weaponized and nations must choose between submission and conflict, that is the weaponization of choke points. As access to global trade routes becomes a paid privilege controlled by regional powers, that is the monetization of access. As energy markets fracture into exclusive blocks and supply becomes a tool of political control, that is the fragmentation of energy security. These are not predictions about a distant future. They are already beginning right now today. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz on February 28th. China is paying tolls to pass through it. India is importing record Russian oil. The U.S. issued sanctions waivers to flood the market. Japan is facing an energy crisis with no solution. Like a match dropped into a room full of gas, the gas was already there. The event just lit the match. The world you grew up in, where you could buy cheap goods made in China, where flights to Europe cost a few $100s, where grocery prices were stable, where supply chains delivered everything on time, where energy was abundant and affordable, where international institutions kept the peace. That world is ending, not overnight, but it is ending. The world replacing it is one where geography is a weapon, where access is a privilege, where energy is a currency of power, and where nations that control choke points control the future. The nations and the people who understand this transition and prepare for it now will be in a fundamentally stronger position than those who wait and hope things go back to normal, because they are not going back to normal. This is the world the 2026 US-Iran conflict is creating, and we all have to start thinking about how to navigate it. If you want more analysis like this explained in simple English, subscribe and tell me in the comments which of these three trends do you think will impact your country the most: the weaponization of choke points, the monetization of access, or the fragmentation of energy security. I will see you next time.